The sound of hammers echoed through the cold Detroit morning. Among the construction workers arriving for another day on the job site, Carlos Martinez stood out not for his height or strength, but for the determination that shone in his brown eyes. At 24, his calloused hands told the story of someone who had known the value of hard work since childhood. But on this Monday morning, Carlos wasn't carrying his usual toolbox. In his trembling hands, he held an official envelope from the Federal District Court of Michigan, a document that could either validate years of sacrifice or destroy the dream he'd built screw by screw in his tiny garage. If you're enjoying this story of determination and justice, please hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring content. The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 7B cast harsh shadows across the mahogany benches. Carlos Martinez walked through the heavy wooden doors, his worn work boots squeaking against the polished marble floor. His only suit, a thrift store find from 3 years ago, hung slightly loose on his thin frame, the fabric showing its age despite his careful maintenance. Judge Harrison Blackwood looked up from his papers with barely concealed disdain. At 58, Blackwood was everything Carlos wasn't: wealthy, connected, and comfortable in his position of power. His custom-tailored robes and gold-rimmed glasses spoke of a man who had never worried about his next meal or whether he could afford rent. "Mr. Martinez, is it?" Judge Blackwood's voice dripped with condescension as he adjusted his glasses. "I see you're representing yourself today. How quaint." Carlos straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of every sacrifice his mother had made, every double shift his father had worked, every night he'd spent in that cramped garage instead of going out with friends. "Yes, Your Honor. I couldn't afford legal representation, but I believe the truth will speak for itself." The judge's smirk was barely perceptible, but the court reporter caught it. So did Margaret Chen, the 67-year-old stenographer who had seen enough corruption in her 30 years of service to recognize it immediately. She had watched Judge Blackwood's career with growing concern, noting how cases involving powerful defendants often took unexpected turns. On the opposing side sat Vincent Ashford III, heir to Ashford Industries, flanked by a team of 5 lawyers in suits that cost more than Carlos made in 6 months. Vincent's perfectly groomed appearance and confident posture suggested a man who had never doubted that money could solve any problem. "Your Honor," announced the lead attorney, Jonathan Pierce, his Harvard law degree practically gleaming from his briefcase, "my client, Mr. Ashford, maintains that Mr. Martinez has unlawfully claimed ownership of a device that rightfully belongs to Ashford Industries. We have documentation proving that this individual was employed by our research division when the alleged invention was created." Carlos felt his heart sink as he looked at the forged employment records. He'd never worked for Ashford Industries, but he knew the power of money in the legal system. His invention, a revolutionary water filtration system that could provide clean drinking water at a fraction of current costs, had been stolen when Vincent had toured local makerspaces as part of a community outreach program. "I see," Judge Blackwood nodded, not even glancing at Carlos's evidence folder. "And what does the defendant have to say about these serious allegations?" "Your Honor, with respect, I invented this device in my garage over the course of 2 years. I have documentation, prototypes, and witnesses who can verify my work. I've never been employed by Ashford Industries." Carlos's voice remained steady despite the intimidating environment. Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair, making a show of examining Carlos from head to toe. "Young man, intellectual property law is complex. It requires extensive knowledge of patent procedures, corporate law, and industrial relationships. Are you certain you understand the gravity of falsely claiming ownership of corporate property?" The implication was clear. A poor construction worker couldn't possibly create something valuable enough for a major corporation to steal. Margaret Chen's fingers moved across her stenograph keys, but her mind was racing. She had seen too many cases like this, where David faced Goliath without a sling. But something in Carlos's quiet confidence intrigued her. There was no desperation in his posture, no frantic energy of someone fabricating a story. Instead, there was the calm certainty of someone who knew they held the truth. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell sat in the gallery, her presence unnoticed by the main players in this legal drama. As a patent examiner for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, she wasn't officially part of these proceedings, but the case had caught her attention when Carlos's original patent application crossed her desk. What she had seen in his documentation had been remarkable, not just for its innovation, but for the meticulous detail that only came from genuine understanding. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Blackwood continued, his tone growing more dismissive, "I suggest you consider settling this matter out of court. Corporate litigation can be expensive for individuals." Vincent Ashford leaned forward, whispering to his attorney. Pierce nodded and stood. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to offer Mr. Martinez a settlement of $50,000 to resolve this matter quietly." The amount was significant, more money than Carlos had ever seen, but it was a fraction of what his invention was truly worth. More importantly, accepting would mean admitting to theft and giving up all rights to his creation. "I respectfully decline, Your Honor. This device could revolutionize water access for millions of people. It's not about money, it's about justice and ensuring this technology reaches those who need it most." Judge Blackwood's smirk widened. "How admirable. I'm sure the court appreciates your noble intentions." The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable. As the morning session continued, it became clear that Judge Blackwood had already made his decision. Every objection from Carlos was overruled, while Ashford's team was given unlimited time to present their fabricated case. The fix was in, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. But what none of them knew was that Carlos had spent the previous 2 weeks preparing for this moment. In his worn messenger bag, a gift from his father, lay evidence that would change everything. The question wasn't whether he could prove his invention's origin, it was whether the court would allow him the chance to present it. The afternoon session began with Judge Blackwood's clear bias hanging over the courtroom like storm clouds. Carlos sat alone at the defendant's table, his legal pad filled with handwritten notes that represented months of preparation. Across the aisle, the Ashford legal team resembled a corporate army, their expensive briefcases and confident whispers creating an atmosphere of inevitable victory. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Blackwood announced, barely looking up from his smartphone, "you have 1 hour to present your defense. I trust you won't waste the court's time with irrelevant technical details." Carlos stood slowly, feeling the weight of his community's hopes on his shoulders. In the gallery, he spotted familiar faces. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner market who had encouraged him, Tommy from the construction crew who had helped him test prototypes, and Sister Catherine from the community center who had prayed for his success. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Carlos began, his voice gaining strength. 3 years ago, my neighborhood in southwest Detroit had its water supply contaminated by industrial runoff. Children were getting sick, families were spending half their income on bottled water, and the city's response was that a permanent solution would take decades and millions of dollars. Vincent Ashford shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the narrative his team had prepared for. "I watched my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, ration water for her diabetic grandson. I saw families choosing between clean water and medicine. That's when I decided to find a solution." Carlos pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with sketches and calculations. "This is my original design journal. Every page is dated, witnessed, and documented." Jonathan Pierce jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. These handwritten notes could have been created at any time, without proper authentication." "Sustained," Judge Blackwood ruled quickly. "Mr. Martinez, the court requires proper documentation, not diary entries." But Carlos had expected this. "Your Honor, I understand the court's need for verification. That's why I brought these. He reached into his bag and pulled out a series of official documents. Time-stamped videos of my prototype development, submitted to the Detroit Public Library's digital archive system. Library surveillance footage showing my regular visits to use their computers for patent research. And signed statements from 14 community members who witnessed my work over 2 years. The confidence in Judge Blackwood's expression flickered for just a moment. Margaret Chen watched the exchange with professional interest. In her 30 years of court reporting, she had developed an eye for authenticity. Carlos's evidence wasn't just comprehensive. It was the kind of detailed documentation that only someone genuinely passionate about their work would maintain. Dr. Hartwell leaned forward in the gallery. She recognized the level of technical precision in Carlos's notebook sketches. These weren't the drawings of someone copying existing technology. They showed the iterative process of genuine innovation, complete with failed attempts and breakthrough moments. Furthermore, Carlos continued, I have something that Mr. Ashford's team cannot possibly possess. He pulled out a device about the size of a shoebox, its metal casing scratched and worn from extensive testing. This is prototype number 7, the working model that preceded my final design. It contains specific modifications and personal touches that only the true inventor would include. Vincent Ashford's eyes widened. He had seen the final design, but this prototype was unknown to him. Your Honor, Pierce interrupted, without expert testimony on the device's authenticity. I can provide that, a voice called from the gallery. Dr. Hartwell stood, presenting her credentials. Your Honor, I am Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, Senior Patent Examiner with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. I reviewed Mr. Martinez's original patent application 6 months ago. With the court's permission, I can authenticate this device. Judge Blackwood found himself in a corner. Denying examination by a federal patent expert would raise serious questions about his impartiality. Very well. Dr. Hartwell, you may approach. As Dr. Hartwell examined the prototype, Carlos explained each modification. The filtration membrane here uses a specific layering technique I developed after my 15th attempt failed. The housing includes hand-filed grooves that improve water flow by 12%. And this component, he pointed to a small metal piece, was machined from a salvaged car part because I couldn't afford new materials. Dr. Hartwell nodded approvingly. Your Honor, this device demonstrates clear evidence of original development. The technical solutions are innovative, and the documentation trail is consistent with genuine invention. Moreover, the prototype shows characteristics that would only be known to the original creator. The courtroom fell silent. Vincent Ashford whispered urgently to his lawyers, realizing that their fabricated employment records wouldn't hold up against this level of evidence. But Judge Blackwood wasn't finished. Dr. Hartwell, while I appreciate your expertise, patent examination is different from legal ownership. Mr. Ashford's company has substantial documentation regarding their research and development in this area. Actually, Your Honor, Dr. Hartwell continued, our office has no record of any similar patent applications or research from Ashford Industries in this technology sector. Their first inquiry about water filtration patents occurred just 3 days after Mr. Martinez's application was filed. The timing was damning. Margaret Chen's fingers flew across her keys, capturing every word of testimony that would later prove crucial. Carlos felt a surge of hope, but he knew Judge Blackwood would find a way to dismiss this evidence. Corrupt judges were skilled at creating reasonable doubt when it served their purposes. Your Honor, Carlos said, I have one more piece of evidence, something that proves beyond any doubt that this invention is mine. He reached into his bag one final time, pulling out what appeared to be an old smartphone. This device contains something that will change how we view this entire case. Judge Blackwood's smirk returned. Mr. Martinez, I hardly think your phone calls are relevant to... It's not phone calls, Your Honor. It's something much more powerful. The courtroom held its breath as Carlos connected the device to the room's display system. Whatever he was about to reveal would either vindicate his claims or destroy his credibility forever. Vincent Ashford gripped his chair arms, sensing that his carefully orchestrated plan was about to unravel in ways he had never imagined. The courtroom's large display screen flickered to life, casting a blue glow across the faces of everyone present. Carlos's hands were steady now, the nervousness of the morning replaced by the quiet confidence of someone about to reveal an irrefutable truth. "Your Honor," Carlos announced, "what you're about to see is footage from a hidden camera I installed in the Detroit community makerspace 6 months ago. I placed it there after noticing that my workspace had been disturbed several times." Judge Blackwood leaned forward, his earlier dismissive attitude replaced by growing concern. "Mr. Martinez, I hope you're not wasting the court's time with irrelevant security footage. I assure you, Your Honor, this footage is entirely relevant to the case." The screen displayed a timestamp, March 15th, 2024, 11:47 p.m. The camera angle showed Carlos's workstation in the makerspace, complete with his prototype, technical drawings, and documentation spread across several tables. The courtroom watched as the timestamp advanced to March 16th, 2:23 a.m. A figure appeared on screen, Vincent Ashford III, wearing a baseball cap and attempting to stay in the shadows. But the camera angle Carlos had chosen captured him clearly as he approached the workstation. Vincent's face went pale as he watched his younger self on screen, carefully photographing every technical drawing, every prototype component, and every page of Carlos's documentation. The footage showed him spending nearly an hour meticulously copying information, at one point even taking measurements of the prototype with a pocket ruler. That's not what it appears to be," Vincent stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. Jonathan Pierce was frantically whispering with his client, clearly unprepared for this revelation. The other lawyers in his team were shuffling papers, looking for any procedural objection that might save their case. But Carlos wasn't finished. "Your Honor, the timestamp on this footage is March 16th. According to the employment records that Ashford Industries submitted as evidence, I allegedly began working for them on March 20th, 4 days after Mr. Ashford stole my designs." The mathematical impossibility was clear to everyone in the courtroom. Judge Blackwood's face had gone from smug confidence to barely concealed panic. Margaret Chen watched the judge's reaction with the trained eye of someone who had seen corruption exposed before. Blackwood was trapped, and they both knew it. The question was whether he would try to destroy the evidence or find some other way to protect his benefactors. Dr. Hartwell stood again. "Your Honor, if I may add context to this evidence, the patent application records show that Ashford Industries filed their competing claim on March 22nd, 6 days after this footage was recorded. The technical specifications in their application are virtually identical to Mr. Martinez's original work, down to the specific measurements we just observed being copied." The courtroom erupted in whispers. In the gallery, Carlos's supporters were struggling to contain their excitement, while representatives from Ashford Industries looked mortified. "This is clearly a fabrication," Vincent shouted, abandoning all pretense of calm. "This footage could have been doctored, staged, anything." Carlos reached into his bag one more time. "Your Honor, I anticipated this objection. I have the original timestamp data from the camera, verified by the Detroit Police Department's Digital Forensics Unit. I also have the makerspace's key card access logs, showing that Mr. Ashford entered the building using a temporary pass issued for a community outreach visit that afternoon. He handed the documentation to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Blackwood. The judge's hands were visibly shaking as he reviewed the evidence. Furthermore, Carlos continued, I have witnessed testimony from Jake Morrison, the makerspace security guard, who remembers seeing Mr. Ashford return to the building late that evening, claiming he had forgotten something from his tour. Jake Morrison stood in the gallery, a weathered man in his 60s who worked nights to support his disabled wife. Your Honor, I remember that night clearly. Young Mr. Ashford seemed nervous, kept looking around like he didn't want to be seen. I thought it was odd, but I figured rich folks sometimes act strange. The weight of evidence was becoming overwhelming, but Judge Blackwood was still searching for an escape route. Mr. Martinez, even assuming this footage is authentic, it doesn't necessarily prove— Your Honor, interrupted a new voice from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned to see Agent Lisa Rodriguez from the FBI's white-collar crime division walking down the aisle, her badge clearly visible. I apologize for the interruption, but this case has become part of an ongoing federal investigation into patent theft and judicial corruption. The courtroom fell silent. Agent Rodriguez approached the bench with a folder of documents. Your Honor, we have been monitoring several cases involving suspicious patent disputes and unusual judicial rulings. This case, combined with your personal financial records showing recent large deposits from accounts linked to Ashford Industries, has provided us with sufficient evidence to proceed. Judge Blackwood's face went ashen. The game was over, and everyone knew it. Agent Rodriguez continued, We have warrants for the arrest of Vincent Ashford III on charges of intellectual property theft, and we have additional warrants pending based on evidence of judicial bribery. Vincent made a break for the courtroom exit, but 2 FBI agents were already positioned there. As he was handcuffed, he shouted, This is all a setup. My family has lawyers who will destroy all of you. But his threats fell on deaf ears. The evidence was too overwhelming, the conspiracy too clearly documented. Judge Blackwood stood slowly, his authority crumbling with each passing second. I call for a recess to review these new developments. Your Honor, Agent Rodriguez said firmly, I'm afraid that won't be possible. Federal marshals are here to escort you from the bench. Judge Maria Gonzalez from the Eastern District will be taking over this case immediately. As Judge Blackwood was led away, the courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters who had been covering what they thought was a simple patent dispute were now witnessing the exposure of a major corruption scandal. Carlos stood in the middle of it all, hardly believing what was happening. His simple invention, born from a desire to help his community, had uncovered a web of corruption that reached from corporate boardrooms to federal courtrooms. Margaret Chen approached him with tears in her eyes. Son, in 30 years of court reporting, I've never seen justice served so completely. Your courage made this possible. Dr. Hartwell shook his hand firmly. Mr. Martinez, your patent application was one of the most impressive I've ever reviewed, but watching you fight for it with such integrity, that's what made the difference. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. As the chaos settled and the courtroom began to empty, Carlos noticed a distinguished woman in her 50s approaching him. Her business card identified her as Rebecca Sterling, senior patent attorney with the Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. Martinez, she said, extending her hand, I've been following your case, and I'd like to discuss something important with you. The federal government has been looking for exactly this type of water filtration technology for humanitarian aid programs. We're prepared to offer you a development contract that could bring clean water to millions of people worldwide. Carlos felt his knees buckle slightly. Everything he had dreamed of, justice, recognition, and the chance to help communities like his own, was finally within reach. 3 months later, Carlos Martinez stood in the same courtroom, but everything had changed. Judge Maria Gonzalez, a respected jurist known for her fairness and integrity, presided over the final resolution of his case. The wooden benches that had once felt intimidating now seemed welcoming, filled with supporters, colleagues, and representatives from organizations interested in his work. Mr. Martinez, Judge Gonzalez announced, based on the overwhelming evidence presented, this court officially recognizes your exclusive ownership and patent rights to the water filtration system in question. Additionally, the court awards you damages in the amount of $2.3 million for patent infringement and defamation. The gavel's sound echoed through the courtroom, but it was a sound of justice rather than oppression. In the month since the corruption scandal broke, the story had taken on a life of its own. Vincent Ashford III had been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for patent theft, conspiracy, and attempted bribery. Former Judge Harrison Blackwood received a 7-year sentence and was permanently disbarred after investigators uncovered a pattern of corrupt rulings spanning nearly a decade. But for Carlos, the real victory wasn't the money or the vindication. It was seeing his invention finally reach the people who needed it most. Rebecca Sterling had been true to her word. The EPA's humanitarian aid contract had provided funding to mass-produce his water filtration systems for deployment in underserved communities across the United States and internationally. The first shipment had gone to Flint, Michigan, where the water crisis had inspired his original research. "Carlos!" called out Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor whose diabetic grandson had suffered from contaminated water. She moved through the crowd with surprising speed, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "I saw the news report about the water filters being installed in our neighborhood. My grandson hasn't had to worry about his water in 2 months." The human impact of his work was what motivated Carlos most. The technology that had started as a desperate attempt to solve his community's problems was now providing clean water to over 50,000 people across 12 states. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell approached with a broad smile. "Carlos, I wanted you to know that your patent has been approved as a gold standard by the Patent Office. We're using it as a teaching example for young inventors about proper documentation and innovative thinking." Margaret Chen, now retired from court reporting, had become an unexpected mentor and friend. "You know, young man, I've seen a lot of endings in my career, but this one feels like a beginning." She was right. Carlos's story had inspired other young inventors from underserved communities to pursue their dreams. The Martinez Innovation Fund, established with part of his legal settlement, was already providing grants and resources to aspiring inventors who faced financial barriers. Jake Morrison, the security guard whose testimony had been crucial, approached with his wife Dorothy, who was using a walker but smiling broadly. "Mr. Martinez, Dorothy wanted to meet the young man who stood up to those bullies. She says you remind her of her late father. He was always fighting for what was right." Dorothy squeezed Carlos's hand with surprising strength. "Keep fighting, dear. The world needs more people like you." The celebration continued outside the courthouse, where local news crews were waiting for interviews. Carlos had learned to handle media attention, but he always made sure to keep the focus on the community impact rather than personal recognition. "Mr. Martinez," called out Channel 7 reporter Jennifer Walsh, "what's next for you and your invention?" Carlos looked around at the crowd of supporters, friends, and colleagues who had gathered to witness this moment. "We're expanding production and working with international aid organizations to bring clean water to communities that have been waiting decades for solutions. But more importantly, we're showing other young people that innovation doesn't require expensive laboratories or advanced degrees. It just requires caring about your community and refusing to give up." As the interviews concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Carlos found himself standing with the core group of people who had believed in him from the beginning. Sister Catherine from the community center, Tommy from the construction crew, Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner market, and dozens of neighbors who had supported his work even when success seemed impossible. "You know," Carlos said, looking back at the courthouse steps, "6 months ago, I walked up those steps thinking I was fighting just for myself. But this was always bigger than one invention or one patent. It was about proving that good ideas and hard work can overcome corruption and power." The Detroit skyline stretched out before them, a city of resilience and renewal that had shaped Carlos's character and values. In the distance, the construction site where he used to work was visible, a reminder of how far he had traveled while staying true to his roots. Agent Lisa Rodriguez, who had stayed for the resolution ceremony, approached with final updates on the federal investigation. Carlos, I wanted you to know that your case broke open an entire network of patent theft and judicial corruption. 7 other inventors have come forward with similar experiences, and we've been able to help them recover their stolen work. The ripple effects continued expanding. Harvard Law School had invited Carlos to speak about intellectual property rights and access to justice. MIT's Innovation Lab offered him a fellowship to continue developing water purification technologies. But perhaps most meaningfully, Detroit Community College asked him to teach a course on practical innovation for working-class students. As the sun set over Detroit, Carlos walked through his old neighborhood, where construction crews were installing his water filtration systems in community centers, schools, and apartment complexes. Children played in streets where clean, safe water now flowed from every tap. At the corner market, Mrs. Rodriguez greeted him with her usual warm smile. "Mijo, you want your regular?" she asked, reaching for his favorite energy drink. "Actually, Mrs. Rodriguez, I think I'll just have some water." She laughed and handed him a glass of perfectly clear, perfectly clean water, filtered by the system he had invented in his garage, validated in a federal courtroom, and now serving his community. Carlos took a sip and smiled. It tasted like justice. 2 years have passed since that transformative day in federal court, and Carlos Martinez's story continues to inspire communities across America. His water filtration systems now operate in over 200 locations, providing clean water to more than 500,000 people. But perhaps more importantly, his journey from construction worker to celebrated inventor has shown countless young people that innovation knows no social boundaries. The Martinez Innovation Fund has grown into a national program supported by major corporations and government agencies who recognize the untapped potential in America's working-class communities. Young inventors from Detroit to Los Angeles are developing solutions to local problems, knowing that their ideas have value regardless of their economic background. Carlos still lives in the same neighborhood where his story began, though his garage workshop has been replaced by a state-of-the-art research facility that employs 12 full-time engineers and technicians, all recruited from local community colleges and trade schools. As he often tells the students he mentors, the most powerful inventions don't come from boardrooms or universities. They come from people who see problems in their daily lives and refuse to accept that this is just how things are. This story reminds us that in America, justice and innovation can triumph over corruption and prejudice, but only when ordinary people find the courage to stand up and fight for what's right. Carlos Martinez proved that the color of your collar matters far less than the content of your character and the strength of your convictions. If this story of determination and justice inspired you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more real stories of everyday heroes who changed their communities. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their dreams are valid, their ideas matter, and their voice deserves to be heard. Because sometimes the most important inventions happen not in corporate laboratories, but in the hearts of people who refuse to give up on a better tomorrow.